Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We have a very special treat for you tonight, so I won't take up too much of your time with announcements or housekeeping notes, but I would like to mention that we are gathered here today, both in person and virtually, to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Learned by Heart, the brilliant new book by Emma Donoghue. We are so grateful to HarperCollins Canada, first of all, for publishing this book, but also, of course, for helping to make this evening a reality. And we're also so thrilled to be partnering on this event with our good friends at the Winnipeg International Writers Festival as part of Thin Air 2023. Now, sad news out of the gate. Our host originally for the evening was Angela Torgerson, who is sadly unable to make it. She adored this book and very reluctantly abandoned her hosting position for her own sake. That said, I'm very pleased that Charlene Deal, the director of the Winnipeg International Writers Guild, the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, I'm mixing up my guilds and my festivals, is here tonight to sit in the hosting chair and lead us through what will surely be an incredibly engaging conversation. Now, just a few very quick housekeeping notes. There'll be a reading from this podium, following which there'll be a conversation on these stools to my left. Immediately after that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. So if you're gathered here in the audience, please just raise your hand and I will wander over to you with this microphone. Not to comment on your ability to project your voice, it just ensures that those watching at home can hear the questions and prevents us from having to repeat them. If you are one of those people watching at home, just write your questions in the YouTube chat and we will put them to Emma as time permits. Following the event, I will have some incredibly exciting notes about signing procedure for you, so stay tuned for those. But the only thing I will put in your brain right now is we will ask you all to remain in place just for a moment while we safely transport Emma over to the signing table. And it'll be very dramatic. And following that, there'll be an opportunity for you to wander over and get all the books you might like signed. But that is more than enough for me. No one is here to listen to me, so I will get into why we are gathered here today. We are here, of course, gathered here tonight to celebrate Learned by Heart, a historical novel based on the true story of two girls who fall secretly, deeply, and dangerously in love at boarding school in the 19th century York. This is a beautiful and engaging new novel, as per Dave Williamson, who reviewed this book most recently in the Winnipeg Free Press. As he pointed out in his review as well, narrative and language aren't sacrificing the fire of historical research in this book. Instead, it's full of relationships that make for an incredibly satisfying novel and observations that ring true and are in themselves memorable. It is a truly remarkable read, and we're so delighted to hear more from the author herself. That author, of course, is Emma Donoghue. Born in 1969, she is a novelist, screenwriter, and playwright. You might know of a book called Room, which sold more than 2 million copies and won the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Commonwealth Writers Prize in Canada and the Caribbean, as well as being shortlisted for the Man Booker and Orange Prizes. Donoghue scripted the Canadian-Irish film adaptation, which was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The Wonder was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and Donoghue co-wrote the 2022 screen adaptation for Netflix. The Pull of the Stars was a finalist for the Trillium Book Award and was longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. Donoghue's fiction ranges from the contemporary, stir-fry, but blending, touchy subjects, Akin, to the historical, Haven, Slammerkin, The Sealed Letter, Astray, Frog Music, and includes 2 books for young readers, The Lotteries +1 and The Lotteries More or Less. Though she's been nominated for and won so many awards, one of the things that stands out most is just how excited everybody I have spoken to has been about her being here tonight. So without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Emma Donoghue.
Thank you. It's very hard to bear such praise, so I can always relax once that bit is over. And by the way, after my reading, there will not be an opportunity to put questions. There will be an obligation to put questions. I don't travel all this way just to hear my own voice, okay? You have to contribute. I also love the idea that we might discuss the arrangements for getting me to the signing table. I'm thinking I could crowd surf. Why not? Two things I'm going to tell you about this book. It has taken me a long, long time to write, in that I first got interested in Anne Lister, the extraordinary Yorkshire diarist, 33 years ago, and wrote my first play about her. And usually I don't go back, but in this case, I was always stuck in the back of my mind was the thought of what it would have been like at the very start of her illustrious career of, writing adventure and industry and seducing all the women in Yorkshire. I thought, what might it have been like the year she was 14, when in an episode that precedes her diary, and therefore we've no close evidence for, she fell madly in love with the girl she was assigned to a room with at boarding school in York, a girl called Eliza Rain, who'd been sent off from Madras in India at the age of 6, away from everyone she knew. So the book took a long time to write, and I also want to tell you that this is the nearest to crowdsourced that any of my fiction has ever been, because I relied in writing it on a team of 14 volunteers who transcribed all the letters for me from scans of the letters between Anne Lister and Eliza Rain in the archives in Yorkshire. So I would log on every morning during lockdown, and there would be another letter from Eliza Rain, like, as if there'd been a 200-year postal delay. It was just thrilling. So I'm going to read you just the first 3 pages. And most of the novel is set in 1804, in 1805, in the boarding school, and it sort of sticks to the rules of boarding school fiction in that it doesn't follow them home for holidays or weekends or anything. It stays in the school, but there are, as a sort of framing device, there are letters that Eliza sends Anne 10 years later at 24. So I think that's all you need to know, just the first 3 pages. My dear Lister, last night I went to the manor again. I open the door here, I don't delay even to pick up a cape, and I step out across the village green. My shoes write inscrutable, fleeting messages on the dewy grass. When I reach the moon-marked road, all I have to do is follow it, and in less than a quarter of an hour at the walls of York, where Booth and Bar has been arching for 800 years, here is that antique hodgepodge King's Manor, hiding our school behind its red brick face. The great medieval door with its lion and its unicorn opens at my touch, and I find myself in the Scented Courtyard. I turn right to enter the manor school itself, where 3 generations of one family have watched over the better-born daughters of the North. I walk invisible from one familiar ramshackle room to the next, through the kitchen and pantry, the refectory and offices, up the foot-worn stone stairs I float, through the classrooms on the first floor, into the north wing, past the mistress's chambers, and up again to the second floor attic, past cook's room, then the one the 4 maids share, then the box room full of trunks and portmanteaus. The 4th door is the slopes, and it springs open to my fingertips. You'll understand my wishful fancy. I pay this visit, in fact, all these tender nightly visits, in my mind's eye only. In the flesh, I have not passed the lion and unicorn and entered our school in 8 years. These days, of course, I am prevented, thwarted by circumstances beyond my control. But last year, or in any of the intervening years since I left, although I often passed the lovely old silhouette of King's Manor, somehow, careless, I never thought to knock on that ancient door. Eliza, I ask myself now, why didn't you go back while you still could? You won't be surprised, Lister, that I so treasure these old haunts. It was in York that I received my education, where I was stamped like warm wax by a seal, formed once and for all. I know you'll recall the song we used to sing, where all the joy and mirth made this town heaven on earth. Well, at the manor school, I tasted heaven on earth, even as I toiled to pack my poor skull with all the knowledge and wisdom I was told I would need for life. The joke is, Lister, the only lesson I learned, or at least the only lesson I remember, was you. We too were so young, had barely seen the change of 14 years, as Capulet says of his daughter. Less than a 12-month the pair of us spent under our sloped-slanted ceiling. But there are fleeting times in life, especially in youth, that shine out more strongly than all the rest and will never fade. Veins of gold in dull rock. For the rest of my life, I believe, I will be transported back in dreams to memory's private theatre, where our girl selves still move, still chat, still laugh. These days, I live on words since my imagination is starved of other stimuli. Not that I keep a diary. The year we turned 17, you did your best to teach me that improving habit, but I always found it hard to pluck details from my daily round that seemed worth recording. Without an interested ear inclined towards me, my words dry up. I lack that bottomless spring that bubbles up behind your clever tongue. It strikes me that your own journal writing has much in common with your other powers, such as walking. Whatever you like, Lister, you do with energy and ambition, almost greedily, and with a vigor that impresses us lesser mortals, even if we sometimes find it exhausting. No, only in letters to one sympathetic listener can I open my bosom and speak my pleasures and pains. So these days I read all day until my eyes are sore, and then I write to you, though all too hurriedly. 2 or 3 pages worth I find is about as much as I can get out under these conditions before I am obliged to lay down my pen. In the night, though, I send out my mind to roam, and of all the places I have lived in my almost quarter century, Madras, Tottenham, Doncaster, Halifax, Bristol, the lodestone to which my restless mind is always drawn as a compass needle to true north is York, and in particular to our manor school. Less than a mile in distance from this house where I sit scribbling now, but in time a yawning gulf, 10 years back to when we were 14. And not just any 10 years, but that vast stretch between raw girlhood and settled womanhood. Like some old lady at 24, I find most fascination in retrospect. The memories come back to me with the irresistible force of waves striking a shore. It would be absurd to deny how changed I am in ways I need not list. I'm not what I was when we met. But I recall that Eliza so vividly. I only have to close my eyes to slip into her, under her skin. Under the mossy, leaky roof of King's Manor, I was quickened to life from the day I first laid eyes on you, Lister. In our slope, I passed my best hours, and sometimes I have to remind myself that they are indeed past. But I tell myself that I'm not dead, not yet. Wilted plants have been known to revive if given just a little water. I'll leave that there, thank you. By the way, sorry she sounded Irish. I've been doing readings for over 30 years. I don't get any better at the accents. And I think Eliza Rain, although biracial and from India, she would in fact have sounded utterly English because she arrived in England at the age of 7 and she would have been careful with every vowel because the last thing she wanted was to draw anyone's attention to her being different. In her letters, she just never mentions her origins except in one letter, she called herself a young lady of colour, and in one letter, she says that she had an illicit birth. But apart from that, never mentions it. But anyway, I once tried to learn an accent for reading from room. I knew I'd be doing a lot of touring, so I got out the Wikipedia entry on American English, and I just tried to study it, and it was so bad. I now respect any actor anywhere who can do any accent that's not their native accent.
Let's just, that's very funny. Let's just actually start there and talk a little bit about Eliza, because she's a complex character, and the voice that you just shared just now, it seems like somebody much older than 24.
Well, you know, just as 80 nowadays can involve skiing, 24 in those days could involve feeling old. You know, it was all about how long you felt likely to live and what your society told you about your prospects were for any more fun. You know, so I think a spinster at 24 felt very old in a way that, you know, skiing 80-year-olds today do not. So I agree.
So let's just talk a little bit about the structure of the novel, that it kind of goes back and forth between these letters, which give us Eliza in her, you know, what feels to us like feels to me like a very young adulthood, but of course to her, she's very constrained in lots of ways. She's, you know, she doesn't have freedom of movement, and we flip from that voice reaching out to Lister, whom she misses, and then we cut back to these kind of long and lively, detailed adventures as students at school. So we kind of move between where she is now and what she's remembering, or we flip back and forth. So I wondered if you would talk a little bit about those two settings, and also kind of what was it like for you to write in those two spaces?
Although I've been, interested in Lister and Eliza for so long, and I certainly thought of writing this novel back in 1998 when I was in York for a couple of months. And I remember going to the building that was their boarding school and, seeing the graffiti that generations of girls had scratched onto the windows and feeling like, oh, I must write that novel. But clearly it took me another 25 years. And it was partly because I was wondering what structure to use to respect the fact that they both had long and complicated lives. But Eliza's, spoiler alert, contained about 40 years of, I would say, unhappiness. So I didn't want the entire novel to be a biographical novel and to have such a downer at the end. So I knew I wanted the novel, like Eliza would have, I think, to focus on that year she met Anne. But I also wanted it to give a frame, because otherwise it would have been, really distorting the truth to just imply, oh, happy teenage love affair. And also, if you give something quite a tragic frame, you can afford for the picture in the middle to be relatively bright and radiant, because it's not going to be sappy, with these, I'm thinking of Rembrandt, say all that gloomy stuff and then a white shirt, So it's all about framing. And also Eliza's letters, which these volunteers transcribed for me, I didn't use any of them completely. I just borrowed lots of ideas from them, but they are in themselves very nostalgic. I mean, she basically thought that she and Anne Lister would be together forever, as they both sincerely meant to be at about 14, but they had to wait 7 years because Eliza, who was the one who had money, her English father had left £4,000 each to her and her sister, and that's like serious money, like no Jane Austen heroine ever had. So, Eliza had all this money coming to her, but at 21. And of course, it's a long stretch between 14 and 21, and not many relationships make it. So Eliza, in a way, she saw Anne Lister like sort of moving forward through life and leaving her behind, and Eliza just stayed very focused on trying to cling on to what they had. So they became very different kind of movements through space. Anne was all about forward momentum, and Eliza was like chewing over the past. And so I thought I always sort of take my cue from my point of view character. And so I thought Eliza herself would probably frame the whole thing as being about memory and nostalgia. And that she'd be constantly sort of mulling over, what did it mean that year we had together at school? What did it add up to? Is school just a kind of, dress rehearsal, a sort of play version of things? Or is it in fact sometimes the most intense life experience you're ever going to have? But of course, before that decision to structure it this way, I'd made the bigger decision, which was to let Eliza have the entire point of view of the novel. Because I had assumed in my years of planning this book that I would do it from the alternating point of view of the two. I mean, it would seem fairly obvious. Two such different girls, different backgrounds. I mean, Eliza had traveled around the world at 6. Anne Lister had never been out of Yorkshire. Totally different. But when I started drafting it, I was writing bits from the point of view of each of them, and I found that only the Eliza Rain bits interested me. So no matter how much you plan in your writing, you could be surprised by the results. And I think it's because by the time I was writing the novel, Anne Lister had become better known. You might not have heard of her, but many people have in the last few years because of the wonderful series Gentleman Jack on BBC and HBO. So she's becoming a bit of a pop culture figure. Whereas Eliza Rain is utterly obscure. And I just found that Eliza's point of view on British society, the way as this kind of outsider figure who's desperately trying to know and follow all the rules, because she can't afford to break any rules. I just thought she was this unique perspective, and so I thought, well, okay, I'll hand her the mic, as it were. Let her be the one to tell this whole story, because she's the one we haven't heard from before, and she's the kind of person who has not been represented in historical accounts. So those were the two big decisions I made, I suppose, was the point of view and when to tell the story from.
So for people who haven't been prowling around in this history, just give us a sort of a snapshot of Anne Lister, who she was, what she and really maybe what she stands for now.
Sure, I think she's this extraordinary kind of voice from the past, in that she kept this diary from her 20s to her late 40s. And so she was kind of, minor gentry, but grew up, with very little money, really. So she was just a a tomboy from a farm in Yorkshire who was very mentally brilliant and very troublesome. So every now and then her family would somehow scrape the money together to send her off to school. So she taught herself Latin and Greek. She studied astronomy and heraldry. She was a person of extraordinary confidence and vigor, and even confidence about things like, I only seem to be falling in love with women, and I found her a particular kind of astonishing welcomer to the past, because she mulled over questions that just don't come up much in sources from the early 1800s. So she would mull over not just her desires for women and what she did with them. She devised a special code, by the way, in Greek letters and numbers for about 15% of her huge diary, for all the, the rude bits as it were, but also things that she was a bit sheepish about, like lack of money. So if she was borrowing money from a bank manager, or mending her corset, or seducing her girlfriend's sister, she would she would record all that in code. And the diary is thought to be the longest in the English language, and it's astonishing. And it hasn't yet been published in multiple volumes by a university press, as it should have been, because the scandal factor put them off. So with the help of hundreds of fans of this TV show, Gentleman Jack, it now has been transcribed and put online. So the kind of Anne Lister community is this amazing combination of sort of geekish historical interests and modern tech, and as I was saying, I've had help from so many people in writing this book. And then Eliza Rein really can be seen as a kind of child of empire, in that we don't know much about her childhood in India, because it was all erased. Her British father, sent her off to England to English his children, as many of these men did. So we know nothing about her Indian mother. She just turns up in his accounts as Dr. Rain's woman, like she's chattel, So Eliza is one of the hundreds and hundreds of children of the East India Company, the biggest corporation in the world. So all these British men went out there and had very sort of stable, long-term kind of country marriages, is one word you might use, say, in the Canadian fur trade, for this kind of informal transracial marriage. And so there were lots and lots of such children. And even though I didn't get to find out much about Eliza's first 6 years, I looked at a lot of other families to see the whole range of responses that they met, and how sort of sporadic the racism was. Like, some of them were abandoned out in India when their fathers left, and others came back to England, blended in with their English families, were apparently very welcome. So something else I found really useful was to look at what Eliza chose to record. Like I say, she almost never mentioned India, only one time mentioned that she was technically illegitimate, only one time mentioned being a lady of colour. But what she did do was, the 2 boarding schools she was sent to, she charted which girls slept in each room and how they were related and where each girl was from. So you can kind of, the vibe you pick up is of social anxiety. If somebody's saying, okay, I have to know who's who and who's related to who, and what everybody's status is. And again, in her letters, she often says things like, must go now, a master's coming to give me my music lessons. So she sounds nervous of breaking the rules, whereas Anne Lister had this vast confidence and wasn't nervous of anything. And another source I found hugely helpful was, in Eliza's whole social circle, nobody says anything at all about her being from India. Just like, blah, 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 let's not mention it. And then there's just this one moment when Eliza quarreled with her guardians, her English guardians in her early 20s. And suddenly there's this pair of letters from a friend of her guardian in the most vile, overtly racist language. And it's as if, it's like seeing a fault line in the earth, and the racism bubbling up and spilling over. And that made me realize that all those years at school, Eliza would have been like, must do my homework, must please everybody, must not give them any reason to say, oh, the Indian girl. So that kind of, tiptoeing over the underlying racism of society. That was one real challenge for me in writing this book, was to get that right.
One of the things that I really loved about the blossoming friendship between the 2 as girls is how frightened Eliza is of how she'll be read by Lister, but that she is praised as being the most beautiful girl. It's this really lovely surprise that you kind of it gives you a different access to, or an idea about how different Anne Lister is from the culture that she walks through.
Yeah, I think in a way they were drawn together, not just because they happened to be assigned a room, but because each of them was unique and different. Neither of them was in any way conventional. And, I tried to give all the girls in their class their own sort of personality, and I tried to use historical data about each of them to sort of, make her something other than a type. But I still think that Anne Lister and Eliza Raine really stood out at that school, and they both had a wealth of experience the others didn't. I mean, Anne Lister was, she was such a tomboy that she boasted that at her previous school she was beaten every day, which would have been extraordinary for a girls' school. Eliza Raine was, yes, and saw her as the most beautiful girl she ever met. And Eliza had lived in London and had this fortune in the bank and had seen the world. And I suppose each of them was in some sense a rarity. And that's a thing that comes up in the book a lot, the pros and cons of being special. Because most teenagers want to be special in some way, but they want to be freakish. So it's a very fine line. And Anne Lister was very ahead of her time in relishing how different she was. She refers in her diaries quite often to her oddity, by which she usually means her desire for women, but also her sort of gender nonconformity. And she says things in her diaries like, I am maybe the missing link between the sexes, or, she'll even joke about it. She'll say like, nature was in an odd mood the day she made me. So she could sound like someone, playful and fascinated by herself, like, a teenager on TikTok. And I'm thinking, how did she manage to be like this in 1805? Whereas for Eliza, clearly, it was so much more dangerous to be different, because very quickly difference would tip over into stereotype. And she, like, if somebody calls you an exotic beauty, you'd be sort of like, hang on, when you say exotic, do you mean brown? The sort of unspoken judgments of Regency society would have weighed so heavily on Eliza. So yeah, that's one thing I thought about a lot in the book was sort of whether you would want to be different.
Yeah, you're right, and that's sort of true for that stage of life, no matter when, right? One of the things that struck me so much reading this is how clearly I was transported to a different place and a different time, and all the kind of codes, behavior codes, etc., and such at the boarding school, but also how familiar the characters all felt to me, because I remember high school too, but also and I just recently had teens in my home. So in some ways, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that you're obviously using historical figures, and you've researched the heck out of another time and kind of found all sorts of things that express that time, but yet
historical fiction doesn't work unless it's timeless as well. Yeah, it's a kind of paradox. And sometimes you can find the timeless details actually by paying very close attention to the historical details. Like, for instance, I found various points of connection to today, and I didn't need to go looking for them. They just came up. For instance, in those days, they had vaccination campaigns and they had anti-vaxxers, So having an anti-vaxxer scene where the girls are all lining up to get their smallpox scratch seemed very natural. So I would say, sorry, I just lost my thread there for a moment. Yes, I tried to put a lot of the timeless in there. So I put in there everything I remembered about being 14 and falling in love. And, the setting in which I fell in love was Catholic convent school in Ireland in 1984. So it wasn't that different, There was the same feeling of like, I'm a high status girl who gets all A's, but if these people knew I was in love with a girl, they'd come for me with burning pitchforks, I dreaded being sent off to priest or the psychiatrist or, expelled from school. So it wasn't that much of a mental leap. I also was lucky enough to have a teenager in the house while writing this book. So my daughter would come home and, give me the in-depth analysis of the social interaction between her group at school, or even, on Zoom. And the details might have been different, but the dynamic, and like how they kill time and when bored, or how they respond to rules, or the frenemy phenomenon. A lot of that went in there, and even just kind of little sort of silly games they have. And some of those I borrowed straight from 2020s because I thought they sound perfectly plausible to have happened back then too. So yeah, with historical fiction, it's going to be dead if you just make it purely historical. I think if you go deeply enough into the past, you're always going to find things that connect to today.
Besides, who's going to check?
But I only a couple of times in my career have I had a reader write to me and tell me I got something wrong, and I feel ashamed. Like I referred to air hissing from a tire in a novel set in the 1860s. And I know, courtesy of one reader, they didn't have air in their tires then, so I'm mortified by that. So I'd rather you trusted me as a guide to the past. I really try not to get things wrong. Sometimes translators will spot an error because translators read your work more closely than anyone else. And they'll say politely, so when you say this, and you're like, oh no, it's 3 years on. Translators spotted an error.
Would you like to share what you found as the most bizarre little detail you found when you were researching this period? Because there must be some weird stuff.
The problem is it's all kind of normalized to me because, of course, during the years in which I was writing this, you know, I was away in 1805 all the time. So I can't actually think of an incident that I would consider bizarre because I'm so used to it. Yeah, it's strange. It's like I'm half a time traveler from then. Yeah.
Welcome here. Well, I thought the pig at school was kind of odd.
You know, the pig is a lovely example of if you use real historical sources, it is better than anything you could make up. So, one particular helper I had, she's a part-time genealogist in Ireland. I've never met her in person, but she was unwise enough to helpfully answer a query of mine on Twitter. And next thing she knew, over the course of an entire year, I sent her follow-up queries. And I had all these different phrases for like, oh, it's really helpful. I just wanted to pick your brains about one more thing. This carried on for a year. And basically she found me detailed sources about all the girls in their class. You know, like I'd send her a name and say like, do you happen to know anything about this girl? And she'd write back saying, well, like, here's the founding document of that girl's father's bank. And, you know, here's where they lived. I mean, she's called Slammerkin, and she's just so much better with the sources than I am. She wrote to me at one point and said, there's a letter from one of their teachers. Would you like that? And I'm like, yes. You know? So in the letter from their teacher, Miss Lewin, which is the only surviving document of this woman, one letter that she happened to send to an Irish playwright she knew, and it turned up in his biography. So this teacher not only talks about the building, this wonderful ramshackle building, King's Manor, that their school was in, and how, you know, bits of it were rented out. There was a big room, a ballroom that was being used as a granary, and there was a room downstairs where a pig was being kept. So, wonderful, we have a pig. I wouldn't have invented a pig, but welcome in. And then the letter also makes it clear that this other woman has moved north with Miss Lewin on the occasion of Miss Lewin getting the job. And I thought, oh my God, they have a lesbian teacher. I would not have made this up. It would have seemed heavy-handed and unlikely and far too lucky for them, but no, they had one. So yeah, I just love that kind of you know, detail from the past that you wouldn't have invented. I mean, it would of course be far simpler just to make up stories and set them in the past. It would have my work, but I don't seem to work that way. I like the stimulus of fact, you know.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. So I think there must be, it's very exciting to read when you can feel the texture, you know, the clothes, the food, the, you know, the architecture. So I'm just curious about how you know when it's time to stop researching.
It's not so much that you ever stop, because I know with all my historical novels, I do what feels like all the research beforehand. And then I get halfway into the first sentence and have to stop and say, hang on, how many wheels did they have on their stagecoach? You know, I have to go back and do more research. Luckily, since the internet, it's been easier to do that. But yeah, research never stops. And even at the copy editing stage, you know, a query from a good copy editor will make you go and re-research something else. I'm working on a film adaptation of my novel, The Pull of the Stars, right now. And I keep having to go back and research the different ways they did CPR back then. There was no one standard policy. So I keep trying to check out the different techniques and see which is the most plausible for 1918. So you keep doing the research, but the skill is to leave most of it in your notes. You know, you may even write it up in a scene, but then as soon as you sort of smell that footnote, you know, if it sounds like a footnote or if it sounds educational, you just cut. And you even tell yourself like, oh, I might put it back in later, but you won't. And if your point of view character doesn't care enough to mention it, and you know, quite a few little scholarly details end up in there because Anne Lister was that kind of, you know, I know the Greek for this word, you know, but only what she or Eliza would care to mention ends up in the book. In my first historical novel, Slammerkin, I don't think I say who the king was because my main character couldn't have cared less who the king was. So yeah, you leave most of it as the kind of enriching soil from which the book springs, rather than feeling that you need to put it in the book, you know.
I appreciated that Anne was such a know-it-all, because wow, there's lots of really cool little down points that I didn't know either.
Yeah, but of course, you know, anyone who keeps showing off their knowledge annoys others too. So I put some of myself into Anne Lister here, because I was that girl. I was known as Dictionary Donoghue, which was not a flattering name. Or occasionally they'd call me Brain Box, which again should have been flattering, but it wasn't. So anyway, I decided that Lister would be known as Lexicon Lister, the Sophocles of the school. Because clever girls often get, you know, passively aggressively complimented in this way. And I even gave Anne Lister a mortifying episode from my own first day at secondary school. I blame my mother. I mean, don't we all? My mother, I had 7 older siblings, and so my mother thought her kids were reliably bright, didn't need the full 6 years of the secondary school cycle. So she'd put us in second year, you know. So she sends me to school in second year, and I don't know any of these people yet. And I tried to crack a joke, and I called them all ignorami on day 1, and they teased me about it for the next 5 years. So I still blush to remember this moment. And so I decided to give that incident to Anne Lister in the book. It's a way of like saying, it's in the book now, it's not mine.
And is it sting a bit less?
I think it does now. Yeah. And you know, writing books does distort your own memory, because I'll sometimes say to my son Finn, who's 19, I'll be like, oh, do you remember that cute thing that happened? And then I realized, no, that's just in the novel room. That's Jack, that's not Finn. You know? It definitely, because you see, you work on the book over and over, right? So those memories are really hammered into your head, whereas your own life you just live once. So I'm afraid, you know, writing books probably does distort my memories, you know. But on the other hand, more generally, I can say the kids have really paid off. You know, I'd recommend to anyone who's running low on things to write about. You know, there are content generating machine.
You just mentioned about blaming your mother, which, you know, yes, we all do. But one of the things that struck me is how little presence there is of mothers in this novel. And I wondered if you'd talk about that, because it's girls and women, but not really mothers.
Yeah, well, that's for 2 reasons, I suppose. I really wanted to sort of honor the tradition of boarding school novels, which deliberately isolate kids in a school setting, don't take it seriously and make it the main focus, and they don't wander off to different locations. They really, the novel stays locked up there. And I like, you know, confined and limited settings. But it's also because when I was researching, you know, all the girls who seemed the right age to be in a sort of, you know, 14 to 15-year-old group in that school, most of the mothers were dead, I have to say. And I think perhaps girls without mothers, or girls whose mothers had died, or whose fathers were marrying new younger women, I think they were a bit more inconvenient. There was a slight tendency to, well, let's send them off to school, you know. So yeah, a huge number of the mothers seemed to be dead. So I kind of went with that, and I was looking at the school, I suppose, as this kind of strange little world where, in theory, they're all being prepared for their lives as wives and mothers, and, you know, perpetuating the acceptable, respectable family. But it's actually this little all-female world, which is not really preparing you for married life at all. So that's a kind of paradox about schools. I also loved selecting the rules for the school, because, of course, I don't know what particular rules they had at the Manor School, but I read memoirs by women from all sorts of boarding schools. And, you know, it seems that in boys' schools, where they would rely on the birch, as they called it, and girls' schools had the most elaborate surveillance and self-accusation and you know, micro supervision of the girls' behavior. So there was you know, I gathered little rules from many different schools, like, you know, don't stand too near the windows when you're dressing. If you take 3 slices of bread at lunch, you're only allowed 1 at dinner. And there was even, you know, to get food, you had to rather passive aggressively offer it to the next person and hope they'd take the hint and offer it back to you. If you got behind in your lessons, like if you failed in your repetition of a memorized passage, because most of the education was literally learning by heart, then you would owe another one for the next day. So you could end up like 10 pieces behind, you know? So I thought all these rules were a great way of creating a sort of microcosm of British society and suggesting that the rules of the whole society were rather absurd, because, I mean, look in this miniaturized version how obviously comical these rules are. you know. I think that the rules of social life were so, were so absurd that at times they were like this kind of invisible shield around people. So in her 20s, Eliza Raine, she committed her money and she was on her own. So she didn't like the harsh climate in Yorkshire. So she tried to go south to Bristol for the winter. But the problem is she didn't know anyone there. And so nobody could introduce her to anyone else. So she couldn't speak to anyone all winter. So it's as if she was in lodgings with this kind of plexiglass around her socially. And, I can't imagine any city in the world that I would move to that I wouldn't be allowed to speak to anyone, So yeah, the boarding school setting was a great way to sort of, satirize the absurd closedness of their society.
And the ridiculousness of what they were being taught.
Yes.
Like, I just didn't get it.
Yeah, I would say that the methods were terrible. There was an awful lot of just memorize that, take half a page of Dr. Johnson's dictionary and memorize it. But also the content, there was a huge emphasis on sort of being, being good and being pleasing all the time. And this obligation to smile sort of thing. I also decided it would make a subtler book if, rather than Eliza being, subjected to simple cruelty by hostile teachers, I thought it would be nice if she encountered the equivalent of, modern virtue signaling liberals. So I decided to write one scene where the headmistress invites her to tea and shows off her anti-slavery teapot. How Eliza would be just squirming as this woman's like boasting of buying special slavery-free sugar,
That scene was just, I could hardly get through that. So you did it. I'm just thinking about the plexiglass, that image of, being surrounded by plexiglass. A lot of what I find I'm thinking about in sort of larger terms of the novel is how much confinement there is, how much restriction, restraint, rules, confinement. You see the Anne Lister character kind of like busting through that stuff. And Eliza Raine kind of trying to figure out what is it so that I don't get hurt by it. So it's not like she is choosing confinement, but she's trying to understand so she won't be trapped in it. But it just seems like her life is really quite terrible in that there's so much confinement all the time, except that she's also the person who comes from the furthest away. So there's this sort of odd...
she comes from far away, but it's as if to guarantee her respectability now, she has to be, framed within an institution. Yeah. It's funny, I'm often asked why I write so much about confined settings. And one answer is that it's technically easier. I applaud those who can write massively epic novels, but, give me a locked room murder mystery and I know where I am. But also I think I often use confined settings because women's lives have typically been too small rather than too big. There's been an awful lot of stay home, yeah, I suppose I'm interested in all those kind of, unwritten rules that would keep you in a life that was more small or confined than you would choose. And the paradox of this woman who, comes from far, far away, but now she has to sort of, stay within the protective walls of the building. And yet encounters a huge amount of unexpected happiness in there too,
And then can you talk a little bit about her as, as that older, like in her older self, because that's also confined in a very different way.
Yeah, and I don't want to give too much away, but Eliza Raine had big struggles with mental illness later in life. And I didn't want to, read her entirely through her end and see everything she did as mentally frail or vulnerable, because plenty of times in her letters, we have letters from her from about 1806 to 1814, and plenty of times she sounds like she's getting on with life, she's studying, she's traveling. But she does have a quality of emotional volatility in her letters, and I really decided to sort of lean into that. I didn't have any clear diagnosis for her because, first of all, nobody back then would write a clear diagnosis. They would just say, has one mad? But also because, the very concepts were different then. So I decided that instead of trying to diagnose her, I would just sort of allow her, as were her madness, to be eloquent, to speak. So I let the letters kind of angle one way or another. So there's one letter that's very, manically confident, where she just sounds like, oh, I'm the Queen of Yorkshire, you know, like everyone turns to look at me and they all copy how I wear my hair. And then in another letter, she's all crushed and depressed. And I think the letter I enjoyed writing most is the one where she is really angry with Anne Lister. And that was the most pleasurable 2 pages to write in the entire book, because, you know, most of the time Eliza's been so focused lovingly on Anne Lister. It was just great to sort of spin the wheel and have her absolutely, you know, condemn and attack her for once. So yeah, I actually, once I decided on this kind of framing device, I really enjoyed getting to kind of, you know, let Eliza lean different ways in the different letters rather than have sort of consistent policy. Because I suppose I was trying to capture the paradoxical nature of memory, that, you know, the very memories that you obsess over can be a source of great happiness or great sorrow if it's a joy that you feel you lost, you know, or that wish to go back and do things differently. I mean, I'm very future focused myself. I'm always, you know, planning the book I'll be writing 10 years from now. But in this novel, I really try to get into the headspace of somebody who feels like her glory days are over. And in one of her letters, her real letters, Eliza says, York is where my sun rose and where it set. You know, the idea that you'd be there at 24 saying like, that was the year I was 14. That was the great year. It was just so sad.
It's so sad. What are you working on?
I'm trying to write a musical, because it's very important to cultivate what the Buddhists call beginner mind, meaning to be a complete newbie in something and feel like an idiot, you know, because the real danger when you've been writing or doing any one thing for over 30 years, the real danger is that you get kind of slack and you think like, oh yeah, I know how to be an author. So in trying, say, films, in the case of Boom and the Wonder, and then in trying children's writing with the lotteries, and then in trying a musical, in each case I felt like a complete idiot who knows nothing. And so it's very refreshing, you know. I'm also working on the next novel and some adaptations, theatrical and filmic. Speaking of adaptations, by the way, I've just come from dress rehearsal of Clue at Royal Manitoba Theatre Centre, and wow, it opens tomorrow and you should run there. It's got the most stunning set I've ever seen. I should say no more, but I heartily recommend it.
We're trying to impress you. I think it's time to open up the floor for some questions.
Me too.
Who's got questions?
And if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll come over to you with this microphone. Yes.
Look, he actually runs. Usually there's a stately walk.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Emma. It was so delightful to hear you speak. I was wondering, for a book like Learned by Heart, which is about 14-year-old students, or any of your books, who is the audience that you have in mind when you're writing? Like, is it ever a 14-year-old girl, or is it someone else?
Yeah, it's funny, a writer doesn't always know who her audience will be. So I published a book of fairy tales way back in 1997, which I thought of as for adults, but in America, my publishers insisted on publishing it for YA, which was a new category to me, and I was a bit like, ew, I don't want to be specifically courting teenagers. But anyway, I'm so glad that they did publish it, because I've got a whole generation of teenage readers who are now reading my adult books. So in the case of, say, Room, I thought perhaps of making it a YA novel, because I thought teenagers would really connect with the story of Jack. But my publisher said the teenagers will get to it too if you publish it for adults. So I suppose I feel the same way about Learned by Heart, that yeah, I think a teenage audience for this one would be lovely, but equally, if I aim it at adults, some teenagers will find it. I suppose I consider, you know, everyone from teens up to be sort of all one category, and I don't really think demographically about my audience. I don't sit around saying like, oh, this will appeal to the 60-year-old women. I mean, you know, in practice, 60-year-old women are probably a huge percentage of the buyers of women-centered historical fiction, but I don't kind of target them in that way. I just imagine the ideal reader who's kind of interested in odd things from the past and who's open to things. I've been very happy that my last novel, Haven, about 3 monks on an island in the year 600, people keep coming up to me and going, I didn't think I'd be interested in monks in the year 600, but I enjoyed this one. So I love the idea that I could lure you, you know, like some dodgy salesperson on the door. I could lure you to try a product that you hadn't thought you wanted. I certainly think it's a danger to visualize your reader in too narrow terms and think like, oh, we must please them. because they don't know what they want yet either. They want to be led on an imaginative journey.
I know we're supposed to ask questions, but you mentioned Haven. That book has haunted me to the point that I went to Ireland to see Skelly Michael and
Wow.
take a look at what that thing was. So I mean, it's an amazing book in many ways because it's historical, but at the same time it gets into the lives of those men in such a way. Anyway, that's not what I wanted to ask is the question authors hate. Do you have a favorite book of the books you've written? I mean, I have a favorite of the ones you've written, but I'd like to know what your favorite is.
I have 3 answers for you. The new baby always arouses the most protective feelings. So right now I'm like, oh, dear little learned by heart. What are the nasty reviewers going to say about you? You know, I feel passionate and protective in that way. I'm very grateful to Room, who is a bit like the son who went off and became a billionaire. You know, he sort of gets a lot of attention, you know, has a flashy car. When he comes home for Christmas, he talks too much, you know. But obviously I'm grateful to Room for having got me those, you know, several million readers. And then you know, the way sometimes you like the child who nobody else pays much attention to. So I'm very fond of my second novel, Hood, which sold particularly badly because it was about lesbians and death. But, you know, I think it's great. So no, I'm glad I wrote them all in their different ways, all from the most obscure, you know, non-fiction work right through to best-selling novels. They're each satisfying to me. And I like the fact that they're different, I suppose. I don't want to have a sort of set Emma Donoghue voice. I'm not looking to have a Emma Donoghue territory or anything. I want to efface myself and just have you enjoy the story. And so I love it sometimes when I meet someone who says, I realized I've read 4 of your books, but I didn't know they were all you. And I think that's great because you had 4 encounters with stories and people who weren't me, you know?
My favorite of yours, though, that I have to say is The Wonder.
Oh, your favorite is The Wonder. Lovely. That's one of the only books of mine that occasionally, just occasionally, gets an angry fan letter saying, why is the ending happy? Because some people read through the book and, you know, there's all this grimness in Ireland and Catholicism and family secrets, and they're just convinced that there's going to be some terrible ending. And then there's a rather happy ending. They're completely unnerved. Why would they write to me to complain? So you can't please all of them, can you?
I'm interested, I've loved all of your books, but that you have three books coming out as 2 movies. How do you find working with the director when you're doing the screenplay and you're sort of losing your power of how that's reflected, and yet all of the 2 movies that you've seen are very close to the book?
You absolutely are losing your power. You are handing away your power. And if you find that an unbearable thought, then you should do what some authors do and just sell the rights and look away. But I love cinema. I find adaptation a really interesting process. I've worked on adaptations of other people's work as well. I love to see what happens when you tell a story again in a different form using different techniques. Not just different techniques, but like it's made of different stuff, right? So I remember in working on Room, one of the things I learned was that, you know, a new screenwriter tends to obsess over the dialogue because you think like, those are the spoken words. That's the bit of the book I'm managing to preserve, or pickle, you know, I must keep all my words, you know, but it's not like that, because I remember one scene I wrote for Room where, you know, Man and Jack are having a bath and she tells him, which I consider to be a crucial fairy tale, the Selkie story. And then in the first edit, I realized they'd taken all the words out, and it was just Brie Larson and Jake Tremblay splashing each other in a bath, and it worked perfectly because you knew all that anyway. You could feel it from their interaction. So I realized that the dialogue you put in is almost like an instruction to the actor about how to seem, and they can absorb that, and often the words won't make it, and that's fine. And the DNA of the scene is still something you've written. You've chosen to take seriously something as banal as a mother and a small child having a bath. So I've learned not to fret over the spoken words too much. Working with directors, I'd say, has been great. There have been a few tears shed, you know, possibly by them as well as me. But no, I think what's really important to remember is that in a film tradition at its best, it will be the director's film. There has to be one person whose guiding vision is the kind of thread they hold on to. You do not want a committee of producers, or above all, a test audience in Akron, Ohio, to decide on crucial matters like the ending. So I have worked with a small Irish studio, Element Pictures, for both my first films. And I generally like to work in that kind of European tradition of where it is the director's film. And I've had a lot of input, the whole scriptive room and shared script of the second one. And, I absolutely love to be involved. And I also realize there's moments when you have to let the director win, because that's what is going to make a good film. So it's something I couldn't do full time. It's not so much the tussles with directors that would bother me. It's the fact that most films don't get made, right? So I've been involved in 8 different screen projects, and so far only 2 of them have made it. And that's not a bad percentage. That's just the reality of how expensive filming anything is. So the unpredictable, development hell of it would bother me too much if I worked in it full time. But as a sideline, it's fine. Especially as you never know what's going to make a film progress. It's so mysterious. People's availability and funding issues, and a tiny change in tax policy can suddenly make something impossible or possible. So I like to just write each draft of the film, send it off, and then just turn away and write the next book.
And we have time for one more question. And there is a question.
I'm wondering about some of the books that you've written that are based on footnotes in history, like, for example, Adrift, the stories in Adrift.
Astray, yeah.
Astray, yeah.
Very similar.
Astray.
Mm-hmm.
So did you set out looking for them, or did you find them out by accident or combination?
Good question. I think I probably came across 1 or 2 by accident. Like, one of them was meant to be a short story. This particular murder in Wales that I came across, I was literally just killing time in the British Library, because in those days you had to order on a handwritten form and then wait about 3 hours for the staff to find the book. You couldn't pre-order them. So I was just killing time and came across this incident, and I thought, I could write a short story about that. But that one turned into a novel. But after that, I sort of kept an eye out, and I did start consciously looking for them, yeah. And sometimes it wasn't even one particular historical incident with a name or a date on it. Sometimes it was just an observation. So in Pierre Burton's book about the gold rush, for instance, the Yukon gold rush, he says at one point that often the shopkeepers made the real money. It wasn't those who actually found the gold. It was just the unambitious ones in the nearest town who were selling them their groceries. So I thought, okay, that would be really interesting if I knew that these miners often worked in pairs. So I thought, what if the 2 of them are there, like, trying to find gold, and one of them says, you know what, I'm just going to join the grocery, So yeah, I came across these stories, incidents everywhere. In my first book of historical stories, The Woman Who Gave Birth to Rabbits, one of them is inspired by a painting, for instance. And quite often they were literal footnotes in other people's books, and I would just, something about the story would stick like a burr in my mind, But yes, once you form the habit of kind of keeping one ear open for historical oddities, you come across them all the time.
I'll now turn things over to Charlene and Emma for any closing comments you might have before I go over signing procedure.
I haven't prepared any closing comments. I hope you have.
I have one thing I'd like to suggest, because I was, if you haven't visited the festival website, the thinairfestival.ca, I would recommend that, because Emma reads from this book, a different passage, I'm pretty sure. And there's also a really fantastic video of some of the research, really beautiful research materials that you were working from to make this book. So you can see images of some of the setting, and it's really fascinating. So it's a little chance to see how a writer / researcher handles materials. I highly recommend that.
No, none of the other festivals is doing that. Nobody ever asked me to provide, videos on different aspects of it. So this is a real plus about the Thin Air Festival.
Thank you. It's a very cool place to wander around. So if you haven't been there yet, it's open till tomorrow night at midnight. So do not delay. Go home, do your research. This has been just a really beautiful way to spend an hour. Emma, thank you so much for offering so forthrightly your experiences as a writer, your insights into the book, and being so generous with all of us here.
And thank you all, especially the people standing up at the back. Well done.
You all had a really great time listening to this conversation. A big round of applause.
So thank you all so very much. Thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have the pleasure of partnering with the Winnipeg International Writers Festival on events like this. And part of my reasoning for wanting to take over closing comments from Charlene, who typically does these whenever we partner with them, is because she always says very nice things about the bookstore, and we never really get an opportunity to say really nice things about the festival itself. So I just wanted to mention how lucky we are to be in a city that has such an incredibly engaged, vibrant, and wide-ranging writers festival. If you do have a chance to visit the website, please, please do, because you'll see what an incredible range of writers and incredible range of materials and books are highlighted on there. It's so wonderfully eclectic, and it's run by such wonderful people. So huge thanks to all at the festival, Charlene, of course, Chelsea, Alina, Evan, Ariel, all the folks that make this festival work. So please give a very warm round of applause to them. And you can take that, Charlie. But thank you all so much for your attention and for your wonderful questions. It was such a pleasure spending this evening with you, and we'll now move on to the signing portion of tonight. So with that in mind, again, I will ask you to remain in place for just one moment while we move our author across the space. I'll let you know when it's safe to piggyback, fireman carry, however it works. And I'll let you know when it's actually safe to come over there to get your book signed. We do have books at the cash desk. We do have books at the table. We have a wide range of Donoghue's other novels here in the store. So if you can't find what you're looking for, just flag down myself or another bookseller and we'll get it into your hands. One more note in that regard is that I will be there as well to write your name on a Post-it note and stick it in a book, which is not because I don't trust you to relate the spelling of your name when you get to the table. It just ensures you can spend more time talking when you get there as opposed to spelling. So huge thanks once again to HarperCollins Canada, to all of you for your attention, to all of you in the back for your patience, and please join me one more time in giving an incredibly warm round of applause for everything.